The first gunshot split the heavy afternoon air like thunder, sending a flock of startled crows into the sky above Silverton, Colorado. Harriet Blackwell ducked instinctively behind a water trough as another bullet splintered the wood just inches from her head. It was 1878, and this wasn't the welcome she had expected when she'd stepped off the stagecoach just 3 days prior. "Get down, miss," a gruff voice commanded as a strong hand gripped her shoulder, pushing her lower. "That's Hunter Steele shooting, and he don't care who he hits when he's in one of his moods." Harriet's heart hammered against her ribs as she peered around the edge of the trough. Through the settling dust of the main street, she could make out a tall figure standing in front of the saloon, revolver still raised. Even from this distance, she could see his face was twisted with rage. "Who is he shooting at?" she whispered to the elderly shopkeeper crouched beside her. "Nobody in particular," the man answered, his weathered face grim. "That's just his way. They call him mean as a rattlesnake, and for good reason. Best you learn that quick if you're planning to stay in Silverton." Harriet had come west to take over her late uncle's general store, hoping to escape the suffocating expectations of Boston society. At 23, she was considered a spinster already, too bookish and opinionated for a suitable match. The West represented freedom, opportunity, and a chance to build something of her own. Nobody had warned her about men like Hunter Steele. 5 days later, Harriet was arranging a shipment of canned goods when the bell above the store's door jingled. She turned with a practiced smile that immediately froze on her face. Hunter Steele himself stood in her doorway, blocking most of the light from the street. He was even more imposing up close, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. His face might have been handsome, if not for the permanent scowl etched into it and the scar that ran along his jaw. "I need supplies," he said without preamble, his voice low and rough as if rarely used. Harriet straightened her spine. "Of course, Mr. Steele. That's what a general store is for." If he was surprised she knew his name, he didn't show it. His cold eyes, a startling pale blue that seemed at odds with his otherwise dark appearance, swept over the shelves. Coffee, beans, ammunition for a Winchester rifle. Tobacco. Harriet moved efficiently around the store, gathering his items. She could feel his eyes following her, assessing. When she placed his purchases on the counter, he dropped a handful of coins without counting them. "You're new," he stated flatly. "Yes, I'm Harriet Blackwell. I've taken over my uncle's business." Something flickered across his face. Recognition, perhaps. "Samuel Blackwell was your uncle?" "Yes. Did you know him?" Hunter picked up his supplies without answering. "Your coffee's overpriced." With that, he turned and walked out, leaving Harriet flustered and indignant. Only after he left did she realize he'd paid nearly twice the cost of his purchases. Over the next 2 weeks, Harriet heard enough stories about Hunter Steele to fill a dime novel. He owned a ranch several miles outside town, where he lived alone except for a few hired hands who rarely stayed longer than a season. He'd come to Colorado after the war, already carrying a reputation as a man to be feared. Some said he'd been a sharpshooter for the Union. Others claimed he'd ridden with William Quantrill's raiders. No one knew for certain, and no one dared ask. What everyone agreed on was that Hunter Steele was dangerous. He'd killed at least 4 men in fair fights if any fight with him could be considered fair, and countless others during the war. He spoke rarely and smiled never. Children were warned to stay away from him. Women crossed the street when they saw him coming. Despite the warnings, Harriet found herself watching for him each time the store's bell rang. There was something about Hunter Steele that didn't quite align with the stories. She'd noticed how he'd left extra money on the counter, how he'd tipped his hat to Mrs. Wilson despite her obvious fear of him, how he'd stopped to help when the stagecoach's wheel broke on Main Street, lifting the carriage with seemingly inhuman strength while the driver made repairs. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon, the bell jingled and Hunter strode in, bringing with him the smell of wet leather and horse. He was soaked through, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, water dripping from his duster onto the wooden floor. "Mr. Steele," Harriet acknowledged. "Can I help you find something?" "Bandages," he said, his voice clipped. "And alcohol." It was then that Harriet noticed he was holding his left arm awkwardly against his side. A dark stain spread across his shirt beneath the duster. "You're hurt," she said, moving quickly around the counter. "It's nothing," he growled, stepping back from her approach. It doesn't look like nothing. Harriet stood her ground. Sit down before you bleed all over my floor. To her surprise, he complied, lowering himself onto a chair by the pot-bellied stove. Perhaps he was weaker from blood loss than he wanted to admit. Let me see, she insisted, approaching him cautiously. I can handle it myself. Despite his protests, he didn't stop her when she helped remove his duster. The wound was a deep gash along his upper arm, still seeping blood. This needs stitches, she said, examining it closely. Just give me the supplies. Harriet shook her head. My father was a doctor in Boston. I assisted him often enough to know how to clean and stitch a wound properly. You'll risk infection doing it yourself, especially to your own arm. Their eyes met in a silent battle of wills. Finally, Hunter nodded once, a short, jerky movement. Fine, he muttered. Harriet gathered what she needed, including her sewing kit. After closing the store, flipping the sign to "closed," and drawing the blinds, she set to work cleaning the wound. How did this happen? She asked, partly to distract him from the pain as she poured alcohol over the cut. He hissed through clenched teeth before answering. Fence wire snapped, caught me by surprise. I didn't think anything could catch Hunter Steele by surprise, she remarked, threading a needle. The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but perhaps the closest thing to it that his face remembered how to form. This will hurt, she warned, positioning the needle. I've had worse. As she stitched, Harriet was aware of his eyes on her face, studying her with an intensity that should have made her uncomfortable, but somehow didn't. His breathing remained steady, only the occasional tensing of his muscles betraying his pain. You're good at this, he said, after several minutes of silence. Thank you, though I'd prefer if my patients didn't come to me by way of violence or accident. You'd prefer fewer patients altogether, I'd wager. Harriet paused in her stitching. What makes you say that? Stores neglected, stocks low, books don't balance. She frowned. How would you know about my books? Your uncle mentioned it, before he died. You knew him well then? Hunter fell silent again, and Harriet continued her work, tying off the last stitch neatly. He was a fair man, Hunter finally said, as if that explained everything. When she finished bandaging his arm, Hunter stood and reached for his duster. Before putting it on, he placed several coins on the counter. That's too much, Harriet protested. For closing the store, he explained. Then, with a nod that might have been gratitude, he walked out into the rain. That night, lying in her narrow bed above the store, Harriet found herself thinking about Hunter Steele. There was more to the man than the town's fear suggested. She'd seen something in his eyes today, a depth of feeling carefully controlled, a wariness that spoke of old wounds far deeper than the one she'd stitched. The next morning, Harriet was up before dawn, baking bread in the small kitchen behind the store. The rhythmic kneading of dough always helped her think, and she had much to consider about her struggling business. Her uncle had let things slide in his final illness, and reopening had proved more challenging than she'd anticipated. Supplies were expensive to ship this far west, and many townsfolk still viewed her with suspicion, a city woman who spoke too properly and wore her hair in an Eastern style. As she set the fresh loaves to cool, Harriet made a decision. Hunter Steele's ranch was said to be about 5 miles north of town. She could make it there and back before the store usually opened at 9. Perhaps she could check on his wound a professional courtesy, she told herself. Nothing more. She saddled the gentle mare she'd purchased upon arrival and set out as the first rays of sun touched the mountains. The air was crisp and clear after yesterday's rain, the scent of pine and wet earth filling her lungs. For all its challenges, Colorado was beautiful in a wild, untamed way that stirred something deep within her. Following the main trail north, Harriet soon spotted a rough wooden sign marking a turnoff to Steele Ranch. The path narrowed, winding through stands of aspen trees whose leaves trembled in the morning breeze. After about 20 minutes, the trees opened to reveal a valley cradling a sprawling ranch house and several outbuildings. A corral held half a dozen horses, and cattle dotted the hillsides beyond. As Harriet approached, a dog began barking, and a moment later, Hunter emerged from the barn, rifle in hand. He lowered it when he recognized her, but didn't look pleased. "Miss Blackwell," he said as she reined in her horse. "You're a long way from your store." "I brought bread," she said, lifting the wrapped loaf she'd tucked into her saddlebag. and I wanted to check on my patient. Wasn't necessary, he said, but he motioned for her to dismount. Come inside if you've come this far. The interior of the ranch house surprised her. It was simply furnished but clean and orderly, with bookshelves lining one walls filled not with dime novels but with classics: Shakespeare, Dickens, Thoreau, Whitman. A desk in the corner held papers neatly arranged, and maps of the territory were pinned to the wall above it. You have quite a library, Mr. Steele, she commented. Hunter, he corrected, pouring coffee into 2 tin cups. If you're going to show up unannounced at my breakfast table, you might as well use my given name. Then I'm Harriet, she replied, accepting the coffee. And how was your arm this morning? He flexed it, wincing slightly. Stiff, but clean. You do good work. May I check it anyway, since I've come all this way? He hesitated, then sat at the table and rolled up his sleeve. The wound looked good, no signs of infection. As she rebandaged it with fresh strips of cloth, Harriet was acutely aware of his proximity, of the warmth radiating from his skin. The bread smells good, he said, his voice softer than she'd heard it before. It's my mother's recipe. She believed fresh bread could solve most of life's problems. Smart woman. When she finished with his arm, Harriet unwrapped the loaf and cut 2 slices. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes, the only sound the ticking of a clock and the occasional crackle from the stove. Why did you come? Really? Hunter finally asked, fixing her with that intense gaze. Harriet considered deflecting, but decided on honesty. Curiosity, perhaps. Everyone in town speaks of you in whispers, as if you're some kind of mythical beast. I wanted to see for myself. And what do you see? A man who reads Shakespeare and keeps a tidy house. A man who's perhaps been alone too long. His expression hardened. I prefer it that way. Do you? She met his gaze steadily. Is that why you came into my store 3 times in 2 weeks when you could have bought everything you needed in a single visit? A muscle ticked in his jaw. You should head back to town, Harriet. People will talk if you're seen coming from my place. Let them, she said, with more bravado than she felt. I'm already the strange Eastern woman who runs a store alone. How much worse could their opinion get? Much worse, he said grimly. I'm not someone you want to be associated with. Shouldn't that be my decision? He stood abruptly. No, some choices aren't worth the consequences. I'll saddle your horse. Frustrated but recognizing the dismissal, Harriet gathered her things. As they walked to where her mare was tethered, she tried once more. The bread is yours to keep, she said, and my door is always open if you need supplies. Hunter's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Thank you for the bread and the stitches. As Harriet rode back toward town, she couldn't help feeling she'd glimpsed something important, a crack in the facade of the man they called mean as a rattlesnake. What lay beneath, she couldn't yet tell, but she found herself increasingly determined to find out. Over the next few weeks, Hunter began stopping by the store more regularly. Sometimes he would purchase small items, coffee, sugar, tobacco, but other times he would simply nod to Harriet and browse the shelves before leaving empty-handed. Occasionally, he would linger, examining a book or household item with unusual interest, though he rarely bought anything beyond necessities. One afternoon in late October, as the aspen leaves turned golden and the air grew sharp with the promise of winter, Hunter entered the store just as Harriet was struggling with a heavy crate of canned goods. Let me, he said, lifting the crate effortlessly despite his still healing arm. Thank you. Harriet brushed dust from her skirt. Just there on the counter, please. As Hunter set down the crate, the bell jingled again, and Sheriff Wallace entered, followed by a young woman Harriet hadn't seen before. The newcomer was strikingly beautiful, with golden hair and a fashionable traveling outfit that immediately marked her as not from Silverton. Miss Blackwell, the sheriff nodded politely, then stiffened when he noticed Hunter. Steele. Hunter's face had gone completely blank, his eyes fixed on the blonde woman who was staring back at him with equal intensity. Hunter? She breathed, taking a step forward. Grace. His voice was flat, emotionless. Harriet looked between them, sensing a history that filled the room like smoke. I'll leave you to your shopping, Hunter said abruptly, moving toward the door. Hunter, wait! Grace called, but he was already gone, the door swinging shut behind him. The sheriff cleared his throat awkwardly. Miss Blackwell, this is Grace Bell. She's just arrived on the afternoon stage and will be staying at Mrs. Holloway's boarding house while she visits our town. Grace seemed to collect herself. Pleased to meet you, Miss Blackwell. I was hoping to purchase some toiletries and perhaps writing paper. Of course, Harriet said, professional despite her burning curiosity. Right this way. As she helped Grace select rose-scented soap and fine stationery, Harriet couldn't help noticing how the woman's eyes kept drifting to the door, as if hoping Hunter might return. You know Mr. Steele? Harriet finally asked, unable to contain her curiosity any longer. Grace's delicate features tightened. Yes, we were acquainted in Denver some years ago. I see. Though clearly Harriet didn't see it all. Their interaction suggested more than a casual acquaintance. After Grace and the sheriff departed, Harriet found herself distracted for the remainder of the afternoon. The arrival of this beautiful woman and Hunter's reaction to her had stirred an unexpected feeling in Harriet's chest, something that felt uncomfortably like jealousy, though she had no right to such emotions. That evening, as Harriet was closing up, the door opened one last time. Hunter stood there, his expression unreadable in the lamplight. We're closed, Harriet said, more curtly than she'd intended. I know. He stepped inside anyway, closing the door behind him. I wanted to explain about today. You don't owe me any explanations, Mr. Steele. Back to Mr. Steele now? A hint of something like hurt flashed across his face before disappearing. Harriet sighed, setting down the ledger she'd been balancing. I'm sorry. It's been a long day. Grace Bell was my fiancée, Hunter said without preamble. In Denver, before the war. Harriet's heart sank. I see. No, you don't. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration she'd never seen from him before. She ended our engagement when I enlisted, married a banker who bought his way out of service. He died last year, apparently. And now she's here, Harriet supplied, understanding dawning. Yes. Do you still have feelings for her? The question slipped out before Harriet could stop it. Hunter's eyes met hers, startlingly direct. No. That man died at Shiloh alongside half his regiment. The bluntness of his answer should have been shocking, but Harriet found it strangely comforting. Then why explain yourself to me? He took a step closer. Because I don't want you thinking I'm the kind of man who would court one woman while another waits in the wings. Court? Harriet echoed, her pulse quickening. Is that what you've been doing, Hunter? Courting me? A rare, genuine smile softened his features. Trying to, not very successfully, it seems. I thought you preferred being alone, she reminded him, even as she moved around the counter toward him. I did, until a stubborn shopkeeper stitched up more than just my arm. The poetry of his words, so unexpected from a man of few expressions, left Harriet momentarily speechless. Before she could formulate a response, the door burst open, and Grace Bell stood framed in the doorway, her cheeks flushed with cold or emotion. Hunter, I need to speak with you, she demanded, then faltered when she saw how close he stood to Harriet. Oh, I'm interrupting. Yes, Hunter said simply. Grace lifted her chin. It's important. About us. There is no us, Grace. There hasn't been for nearly 15 years. People change, she insisted. I've changed. I made a mistake, Hunter. I was young and frightened. So was I, he replied, his voice gentler than Harriet expected. But I made my choices, and you made yours. We're different people now. Grace's gaze shifted to Harriet, assessing and slightly hostile. I see you found comfort with the local shop girl. How quaint. Harriet bristled at the condescension in her tone, but Hunter spoke before she could respond. Miss Blackwell is a businesswoman of considerable intelligence and character, he said, his voice taking on the dangerous edge Harriet had heard that first day in town. You do well to remember that in her store. Grace's eyes widened at his defense. You really have changed, she murmured, then collected herself. Fine, but we still need to talk, Hunter. I'll be in town for several weeks. You know where to find me when you're ready to be reasonable. With that, she swept out, leaving a cloud of expensive perfume and tension in her wake. I'm sorry about that, Hunter said after a moment. It's not your fault, Harriet replied, though the encounter had left her shaken. She obviously still has feelings for you. Grace has feelings for the idea of me, he corrected. The young man I was before the war. That person doesn't exist anymore. Harriet studied his face, the hard lines etched by sun and experience. The scar along his jaw, the eyes that had seen too much death. Who are you now, then? He seemed to consider her question seriously. I'm not entirely sure, he admitted, but I'd like to find out. With you, if you're willing. The simplicity and honesty of his declaration touched Harriet deeply. I'd like that too. Hunter reached out slowly, as if giving her time to withdraw, and brushed a strand of hair from her face. The gentle touch sent warmth spreading through her. May I call on you properly? Sunday, after church? I'd like that, Harriet said again, finding it difficult to form more eloquent responses with him standing so close. Good. He stepped back, restoring a proper distance between them. I should let you finish closing up. As he turned to leave, Harriet called after him. Hunter, what happened to your arm? Really? He paused with his hand on the door. Broke up a knife fight at the saloon. One of the miners got in a lucky slice. Why not tell me that? Didn't want you thinking worse of me for brawling. I would have thought better of you for stopping a fight, not starting one. He considered this. I'll try to remember that. Good night, Harriet. Good night, Hunter. After he left, Harriet leaned against the counter, her emotions in turmoil. In the span of a day, the careful friendship she had been building with Hunter had transformed into something more complicated and more promising. But Grace Bell's arrival cast a shadow over these new developments. Despite Hunter's assurances, Harriet couldn't help wondering if old feelings might resurface given time. Word spread quickly in Silverton that Hunter Steele was officially calling on Harriet Blackwell. By Sunday morning, the church pews were unusually full, with townsfolk eager to witness this unexpected development. When Hunter arrived, clean-shaven and wearing what was clearly his best shirt, a hush fell over the congregation. He sat beside Harriet, ignoring the stares and whispers. Grace Bell sat across the aisle, her expression alternating between sorrow and determination throughout the service. Afterward, as people gathered on the church steps, Sheriff Wallace approached them. Steele, he said with a nod that wasn't entirely friendly. A word? Hunter excused himself to Harriet and moved aside with the sheriff. Though she couldn't hear their conversation, she could see the increasing tension in Hunter's shoulders. When he returned, his expression was dark. Everything all right? She asked. Fine, he replied, offering his arm. Shall we? They walked to the small restaurant that served Sunday dinners, aware of the eyes following them. Inside, Hunter secured a table by the window and helped Harriet into her seat with unexpected grace. What did the sheriff want? Harriet asked once they were settled. Hunter's jaw tightened. To warn me. About what? You. He met her eyes directly. He thinks I'm not good for you, that my reputation will hurt your standing in town. That's not his business, Harriet said indignantly. No, but he's not wrong. Hunter's fingers drummed once on the tablecloth before stilling. People have long memories, Harriet. The things I've done are in the past, she interrupted. Unless there's something you haven't told me? He hesitated. I've killed men. In the war, and in self-defense, from what I've heard. Not always. The admission seemed to cost him something. There was a time after the war when I wasn't particular about who I rode with or what jobs I took. Harriet absorbed this. But you changed. You built a legitimate ranch. You settled here. Yes. Why? Hunter looked out the window, his profile sharp against the light. Got tired of looking over my shoulder, tired of not recognizing myself. He paused. Your uncle helped. My uncle? Samuel caught me stealing from his store 8 years ago. He was alone, could have shot me, would have been justified. Instead, he offered me coffee and a job breaking horses for him. Harriet's heart swelled with pride for her uncle, even as she processed this revelation about Hunter. That sounds like Uncle Samuel. He was a good man, one of the few who saw something in me worth saving. Hunter's eyes returned to hers. Like his niece seems to. Their meal arrived, temporarily halting the conversation. As they ate, Hunter told her more about her uncle, how he'd loaned Hunter the money to buy his first plot of land, how he'd taught him about breeding cattle, how he'd shared books from his personal collection. "I never knew," Harriet said softly. "He didn't mention you in his letters. He was protecting my privacy, and probably yours." Hunter's mouth quirked. Wouldn't want his respectable niece knowing he'd befriended an outlaw. "Former outlaw," Harriet corrected. "Some would say that distinction doesn't matter much. I would say it makes all the difference in the world." Their eyes held, and something shifted between them, a deepening understanding, a growing trust. Hunter reached across the table and briefly covered her hand with his, a gesture so unexpected it left Harriet breathless. The moment was broken when Grace Bell entered the restaurant, accompanied by two of the town's most prominent widows. She spotted Hunter and Harriet immediately, and, after a brief consultation with her companions, approached their table. "How lovely to see you both," she said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "Hunter, I was just telling Mrs. Jenkins about how we used to attend the opera together in Denver. Remember that stunning production of La Traviata?" Hunter's expression revealed nothing. "That was a long time ago, Grace. But we had such wonderful times," she persisted. "Miss Blackwell, has Hunter taken you to Denver yet? The city has grown so much since the war, the culture, the society. It's quite something after a small mining town." "I haven't had the pleasure," Harriet replied evenly, "though I lived in Boston until recently, so I'm quite familiar with city life." Grace's smile tightened. "Boston? How provincial. I spent a season in New York before my marriage. There's really no comparison." Hunter stood abruptly. "If you'll excuse us, Grace, Harriet and I were just finishing." Though they had barely touched their dessert, Harriet followed his lead, recognizing his need to escape the uncomfortable confrontation. Hunter paid quickly, and they stepped out into the crisp autumn air. "I'm sorry," he said, as they walked away from the restaurant. "Grace always did know how to make a scene." "She's trying to remind you of what you had together," Harriet observed. "What she thinks we had," Hunter corrected. "I was a different man than younger, ambitious, trying to prove myself worthy of her family's approval. Looking back, I'm not sure I even knew who I was beneath all that striving." They walked in silence for a moment, their breath fogging in the cool air. "Would you like to see my ranch again?" Hunter asked suddenly. "Properly this time, not just because you're checking on a patient." Harriet hesitated only briefly. "I'd like that very much." The following Saturday dawned clear and cold, perfect for riding. Hunter arrived at the store just after it opened, leading not only his own horse, but also a sleek chestnut mare. "She's gentler than that old nag you rode out last time," he explained, "and faster." "She's beautiful," Harriet said, stroking the mare's velvety nose. "But I can't accept such an extravagant gift." "It's not a gift," Hunter clarified, "just a loan, for today." Relieved, Harriet quickly closed the store and changed into her riding clothes, a practical split skirt that had scandalized some of the more conservative townsfolk when she'd first worn it. When she emerged, Hunter was waiting patiently, holding both horses' reins. His eyes widened slightly at her attire. "Practical," he commented approvingly. "My aunt would faint if she could see me now," Harriet laughed as Hunter helped her mount. "She always insisted ladies should ride side saddle, even if it meant breaking their necks at the first jump." The ride to Hunter's ranch was leisurely, with Hunter pointing out landmarks and sharing the history of the valley. He seemed more relaxed away from town, more willing to speak at length. Harriet found herself charmed by this side of him, the knowledgeable rancher who noticed every hawk circling overhead, every change in the landscape. At the ranch, Hunter gave her a proper tour of the stables with their fine horses, the corrals where young colts frolicked, the barn with its sweet-smelling hay, and finally, the house itself. In daylight, Harriet could better appreciate the craftsmanship of the place. The main room was dominated by a stone fireplace Hunter had built himself, the mantel made from a single piece of polished pine. "It's wonderful," Harriet said sincerely. "You've built something truly special here." "It's just a ranch," Hunter demurred, though she could tell her approval pleased him. "It's more than that. It's a home." Something vulnerable flashed across his face. It was always meant to be. The implication hung in the air between them that he had built this place not just for himself, but for a future he'd once imagined. Whether that future had included Grace or was simply a hope for a family someday, Harriet couldn't tell. They ate lunch on the wide porch, watching clouds build over the distant mountains. Hunter spoke more openly than he ever had before, telling Harriet about his childhood in Kentucky, his brief time at university before the war, the horrors he'd witnessed as a Union sharpshooter. After Shiloh, I couldn't sleep without drinking myself unconscious first, he admitted. Kept seeing their faces, the men I'd killed, some no older than boys. Is that why you... Harriet hesitated, unsure how to phrase it delicately. Why I went bad after, Hunter finished for her. Partly, felt like I'd already damned myself, so what did it matter what I did next? Rode with some rough men for a few years, did things I'm not proud of. What changed? He was quiet for so long, Harriet thought he might not answer. Woke up one morning in a camp in Arizona territory. Found myself holding a gun on a young woman, a settler's daughter our gang had taken. She looked at me with such terror. His voice grew hoarse. Saw myself through her eyes and couldn't stand what I'd become. Let her go. Left the gang. Drifted north until I reached Colorado. And found my uncle, Harriet supplied. And found salvation of a sort, Hunter agreed. Though plenty in town would say I'm still that same man. They're wrong, Harriet said firmly. People can change. I believe that with all my heart. Hunter studied her face, as if searching for doubt or deception. Finding neither, he seemed to come to a decision. Harriet, he began, then stopped as the sound of approaching horses reached them. 3 riders appeared around the bend, Sheriff Wallace and 2 deputies. They reined in at the porch steps, dust settling around them. Steele, Wallace called, his hand resting near his gun. We need to talk. Hunter stood slowly. What's this about, Sheriff? Wallace's eyes flickered to Harriet. Miss Blackwell, you might want to step inside. Whatever you have to say can be said in front of me, Harriet replied, rising to stand beside Hunter. The sheriff sighed. Have it your way. Hunter Steele, I'm here about the robbery of the Denver mail coach 3 days ago. A passenger identified a man matching your description as one of the bandits. That's ridiculous, Harriet protested. Hunter was in town 3 days ago. He spent the morning helping me unload a shipment of flour. That was in the afternoon, Miss Blackwell, Wallace corrected. The robbery took place at dawn, just over the pass. A man could ride there and back in time to be in town by noon. Hunter's face had gone completely still. Who identified me? Wallace hesitated. Miss Bell was on that coach. Understanding dawned on Harriet. She's lying, she said firmly. She's trying to cause trouble because Hunter rejected her. That's a serious accusation, Wallace replied, though Harriet could see doubt in his eyes. Check my stable, Hunter said calmly. None of my horses show signs of a hard ride recently, and I have no need for money. My ranch is doing well. I'll need to search the place, Wallace said, just to be thorough. Hunter nodded once. Go ahead. You won't find anything because there's nothing to find. The search took over an hour, with the deputies combing through the house and outbuildings while Wallace kept a watchful eye on Hunter. They found nothing, no stolen mail, no unusual amounts of money, nothing to connect Hunter to the robbery. Satisfied? Hunter asked when they finished. Wallace looked uncomfortable. For now. But I'll need you to come to town tomorrow to give a formal statement. And Miss Bell is quite insistent about what she saw. I'm sure she is, Hunter muttered. After the sheriff and his men rode off, Hunter paced the porch, his earlier openness replaced by a simmering anger. She's trying to force my hand, he said. She thinks if she causes enough trouble, I'll agree to see her just to make it stop. Will you? Harriet asked, hating the insecurity in her voice. Hunter stopped pacing and faced her. No, but I need to confront her directly. Make it clear that these games won't work. I'll come with you, Harriet offered. He shook his head. This is between Grace and me, something I should have settled years ago. They rode back to town in a more subdued mood than their morning journey. At Harriet's store, Hunter helped her dismount, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. I'm sorry our day was interrupted, he said. It's not your fault. Harriet gathered her courage. What were you going to say before the sheriff arrived? Hunter's eyes softened. That I'm grateful you've seen beyond the reputation, beyond the man they call mean as a rattlesnake. That man never existed, Harriet said quietly. Not really, just a shield you built around yourself. He smiled slightly. Maybe you're right. After a brief hesitation, he bent and pressed a gentle kiss to her cheek. Good night, Harriet. Good night, Hunter. She watched him ride away, her heart full of conflicting emotions, happiness at the growing closeness between them, worry about Grace's false accusations, and a deeper concern about the town's willingness to believe the worst of Hunter, despite years of peaceful living among them. The next morning, Harriet opened the store to find a small package on the doorstep. Inside was a beautifully carved wooden box containing a silver hairpin shaped like an aspen leaf. A note in Hunter's distinctive handwriting read simply, "For yesterday's interrupted conversation, H.S." The gift brought a smile to Harriet's face that lasted until mid-morning when Grace Bell swept into the store, elegantly dressed despite the early hour. "Miss Blackwell," she greeted coolly, "I hope I'm not interrupting your business?" "Not at all," Harriet replied with equal coolness. "How may I help you today, Miss Bell?" Grace made a show of examining a display of gloves. "I wanted to speak with you, woman to woman, about Hunter. I'm not sure that's appropriate." "Perhaps not, but it's necessary." Grace abandoned the pretense of shopping. "You don't know him like I do. The Hunter Steele I knew in Denver was charming, ambitious, destined for greatness. The war changed him, broke something essential in him." "People change," Harriet acknowledged, "sometimes for the better." Grace gave a delicate laugh. "You can't possibly believe he's reformed. Men like Hunter don't change their nature, they just hide it better." "Is that why you accused him of robbery? Because you believe he's still a criminal at heart?" Grace had the grace to look momentarily discomfited. "I saw what I saw," she insisted. "And if it wasn't him, it was someone remarkably similar." "Perhaps you saw what you wanted to see," Harriet suggested. "A way to force Hunter to pay attention to you." Grace's beautiful face hardened. "You're making a mistake, Miss Blackwell. Hunter Steele is dangerous not just because of his past, but because he'll never truly settle down. He's not the kind of man who can give a woman the life she deserves." "I believe that's my judgment to make," Harriet replied firmly. "Now, unless you need to purchase something, I have inventory to attend to." With a final assessing look, Grace turned and left, the bell jingling sharply behind her. By afternoon, Harriet heard that Hunter had given his statement to the sheriff and been released, though Wallace had made it clear the investigation remained open. The town buzzed with gossip, opinion divided between those who believed Hunter guilty simply because of his past and those who questioned Grace's motives. Hunter didn't come to the store that day, and Harriet tried not to let his absence worry her. He was likely busy with ranch work, she told herself, or perhaps giving the gossip time to die down before calling on her again. As she was closing up, Mrs. Wilson from the millinery shop next door stopped in, her round face pinched with concern. "You haven't heard, then?" she asked when Harriet greeted her. "Heard what?" "Hunter Steele and Grace Bell were seen arguing outside the hotel. Quite a spectacle, from what I hear." He looked ready to throttle her. Harriet's heart sank. "When was this?" "Just an hour ago. Sheriff had to step in, separate them. Miss Bell was in tears, claiming he'd threatened her." "That doesn't sound like Hunter," Harriet said, though a small seed of doubt took root. She'd seen his temper flare before. Knew he was capable of intimidating fury. "Well, I just thought you should know, dear." Mrs. Wilson patted her arm. "Being as you've been friendly with him lately." After Mrs. Wilson left, Harriet stood indecisively by the counter. Should she seek Hunter out? Wait for him to come to her? The uncertainty was maddening. Her decision was made for her when, just after sunset, a knock came at the store's back door. Hunter stood there, his face shadowed in the gathering dusk. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice rough. Harriet stepped back silently, allowing him to enter the small living quarters behind the store. In the lamplight, she could see a bruise forming along his cheekbone. "What happened?" she asked, reaching instinctively to touch the mark. He caught her hand, holding it gently away from his face. "Wallace happened. Got a bit enthusiastic when I wouldn't back down. Mrs. Wilson said you were arguing with Grace." Hunter's jaw tightened. "I confronted her about her lies. She admitted she wasn't certain it was me. She claimed she was just confused by the robber's resemblance." So she'll tell the sheriff the truth? No? Hunter released her hand and paced the small room. She says she'll retract her statement if I agree to escort her to the town dance next weekend. If not, she'll stick to her story. Harriet felt as if she'd been slapped. That's blackmail. Yes. His voice was flat. She's desperate, Harriet. She came west thinking I'd welcome her back with open arms. Finding me interested in another woman has made her reckless. What will you do? Hunter stopped pacing and faced her directly. That depends on you. Me? If I refuse her, this won't end. She'll keep causing trouble for me and for you. Your reputation in town is already suffering because of your association with me. I don't care about that, Harriet said fiercely. You should. His expression softened. You've built something here, Harriet. A business, a place in the community. I don't want to be the reason you lose it. Understanding dawned. So, you're considering taking her to the dance? Giving in to her demands? Just long enough to get her to retract the accusation. Once my name is cleared, I can end things permanently. And if she makes more demands? Hunter had no answer for that, and his silence told Harriet all she needed to know. I see, she said quietly. You should go. Harriet, no. She stepped back, creating distance between them. If you believe capitulating to blackmail is the solution, then we clearly have different values, Hunter. I won't stand in your way. His face hardened into the mask she'd seen that first day in town, remote, dangerous, unreadable. You're right. We're too different. This was a mistake. The words cut deeper than Harriet had expected, despite being an echo of her own thoughts. Without another word, Hunter turned and walked out the back door, disappearing into the night. Harriet sank onto a chair, tears threatening. She'd believed in him, defended him to others, begun to care for him deeply. And at the first real challenge, he'd chosen the path of least resistance rather than standing firm for the truth. The next day, Sunday, Harriet skipped church for the first time since arriving in Silverton, unable to face seeing Hunter and Grace together. Instead, she threw herself into reorganizing the store, physically exhausting herself to avoid thinking about her shattered hopes. By Monday, the gossip had shifted. Hunter Steele had apparently escorted Grace Bell to dinner at the hotel, looking quite the gentleman, according to Mrs. Wilson's breathless account. The robbery accusation was quietly dropped, with the sheriff announcing that new evidence had cleared Hunter of suspicion. Harriet maintained a stoic facade as customers shared these tidbits, but inside, she felt hollow. She had misjudged him after all, or perhaps she had seen what she wanted to see, just as she had accused Grace of doing. On Wednesday afternoon, as Harriet was helping young Tommy Jenkins select penny candy, the store door opened to admit Hunter. He looked tired. The bruise on his cheek faded to a yellowish stain, his eyes shadowed. "Miss Blackwell," he said formally, nodding to her. "Mr. Steele," she replied, equally formal. "What can I help you with today?" Tommy, sensing tension, quickly made his selection and scurried out, leaving them alone in the store. "I need to explain," Hunter said once the boy was gone. "There's no need," Harriet busied herself straightening the candy jars. "I understand perfectly. You did what you thought necessary." "No, you don't understand." He moved closer, his voice dropping. "I didn't take Grace to the dance. I never agreed to her demands." Harriet's hands stilled. "But everyone sees what they expect to see," Hunter interrupted. "I spoke with Wallace privately, told him everything. He didn't believe me until I suggested he wire the Denver authorities about Grace's late husband." "Her husband? What about him?" "He didn't die of natural causes, as she claimed. He was shot during a bank robbery. Grace was briefly held as an accomplice before being released for lack of evidence." Harriet's eyes widened. "She was involved with criminals?" "Always had a taste for dangerous men," Hunter confirmed grimly, "until they became too dangerous for comfort." When Wallace confronted her with this information, she broke down, admitted she'd invented the whole identification to pressure me. "So, you never took her to dinner?" "No, that was Wallace's idea, make it look like she'd gotten what she wanted while he verified my story. By the time she realized she'd been outmaneuvered, it was too late." She left on yesterday's stage. Relief flooded through Harriet. followed quickly by shame. "I didn't trust you," she said quietly. "I thought you'd given in." "You had reason to doubt me," Hunter acknowledged. "My past doesn't inspire confidence. Still, I should have had more faith." Harriet looked up at him. "I'm sorry, Hunter." He took a step closer. "Does this mean you might reconsider about us?" The hope in his eyes gave Harriet courage. "I never stopped caring for you," she admitted, "even when I thought you'd chosen her." Hunter's smile transformed his face, erasing years of hardness. "Then I have something to ask you." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object, holding it carefully in his palm. It was a ring, a simple gold band set with a single small diamond. "It was my mother's," he explained, his voice unexpectedly nervous. "I've kept it all these years, waiting for... I never thought I'd find someone I wanted to give it to." Harriet's breath caught. "Hunter, I know it's fast," he hurried on, "and I know your aunt in Boston would probably faint at the idea of you marrying a former outlaw with a reputation for violence. But I love you, Harriet. You saw through the man they called mean as a rattlesnake to the man beneath. You fed that man kindness when others offered only fear and judgment." Tears sprang to Harriet's eyes. "I love you too," she whispered. "Will you marry me? Come live at the ranch, help me make it the home it was always meant to be." "Yes," Harriet said without hesitation. "Yes, I will." Hunter slipped the ring onto her finger, then drew her into his arms, kissing her with a gentleness that belied his fearsome reputation. Harriet returned the kiss, feeling as though her heart might burst with happiness. The bell over the door jingled, and they broke apart to find Sheriff Wallace standing in the doorway, looking embarrassed. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, removing his hat. "Just wanted to let you know, Steele the real mail coach robbers were caught in Durango this morning. 3 brothers from Texas. Case is officially closed." "Thank you, Sheriff," Hunter said, his arms still around Harriet's waist. Wallace nodded, his eyes moving to Harriet's hand, where the ring now sparkled. "Congratulations to you both. For what it's worth, I think you'll be good for each other." With that, he replaced his hat and departed. "Well," Harriet said with a small laugh, "if the sheriff approves, perhaps the rest of the town will come around eventually." "They will," Hunter assured her, "once they see that the man they called mean as a rattlesnake is capable of change thanks to a woman who fed him kindness." Epilogue. 2 years later, the spring air was sweet with the scent of wildflowers as Harriet Steele sat on the wide porch of the ranch house, watching her husband teach their infant son to pat the nose of a gentle mare. At 10 months old, little Samuel, named for the uncle who had set this all in motion, was already fearless around the horses, much to his father's obvious pride. "Not too close," Harriet called, though she knew Hunter was being careful. Hunter glanced back at her with a smile that still made her heart skip. "He's fine. Got a natural way with horses, just like his mama." In the 2 years since their marriage, the Steele ranch had prospered. With Harriet's business sense complementing Hunter's knowledge of ranching, they had expanded their holdings and begun breeding some of the finest horses in the territory. The general store in town, now managed by a capable young widow, continued to bear the Blackwell name, but provided a steady income for the Steele family. More remarkably, the town's perception of Hunter had gradually shifted. It began with the wedding, attended by a surprisingly large number of townsfolk, curious to see if the infamous Hunter Steele could actually stand before a preacher without bursting into flames. Then came Hunter's actions during a devastating flood last spring, when he had risked his life repeatedly to rescue stranded families. By the time little Samuel was born, most of Silverton had revised their opinion of the man they once called mean as a rattlesnake. As Hunter approached the porch with Samuel in his arms, Harriet felt a familiar wave of gratitude for the life they had built together. "What are you thinking about?" Hunter asked, settling beside her on the swing, their son nestled between them. "About how far we've come," she replied, leaning her head against his shoulder. "About how love can transform a person." Hunter's arm tightened around her. "Or reveal who they truly were all along, beneath the scars and armor." "Perhaps a bit of both," Harriet conceded. As the sunset painted the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, Hunter pressed a kiss to his wife's temple. "Thank you," he murmured. "For what?" "For seeing me. For feeding kindness to a man who'd forgotten the taste of it." Harriet smiled, watching as their son's eyes began to droop with sleep. Always, she promised, for the rest of our days. And as twilight settled over the Steele ranch, bringing with it the first stars of evening, Harriet knew that promise would endure, as would the love that had transformed a feared outlaw into a devoted husband and father, proving that even the hardest heart could be softened by kindness freely given.